That was She's My Favorite by Don't Bite Your Tongue. But yeah, I personally really like that song. I think that like the very modern, punchy production with the slightly like auto-tuned vocals is a really cool sound.
Well, it's interesting to hear that newer wave of pop punk, and forgive me if this is like a bad connotation, but that like Machine Gun Kelly inspired pop punk,
yeah.
Would that be sort of an accurate?
Okay, I think so. I mean, definitely like the kind of heavier drums, Travis Barker style production. I totally get that for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a good thematic to point out of that. It's interesting to see that melding of it, because I know there are some Atlanta artists around here who fit in that similar vein. I wanted to see what happened to pop punk after the mid 2010s, because I think a lot of it got kind of, I don't know if stale is the right word, but when music starts to become like a parody of itself, then it's time to deviate and move on in a lot of ways. And it doesn't really matter what direction. I think a lot of music is refractory, and it doesn't have like a specific direction it bounces off of. It goes in a lot of different ways, and you see that here, and you see the influence of, like you said, Travis Barker, and going, that Blink influence is there, even if some of those artists don't even really realize it. But I think it's cool. Well, I was never a huge pop punk guy, but you can feel the energy in it, and I know people love it.
I think it's really interesting. You kind of touched on that a little bit, but like especially with some of these genres that were like, they're still new-ish, but we're like a couple generations deep at this point. Like I think metalcore, post-hardcore is kind of like a good example of that as well. There's a lot of bands that are still highly influential that people don't realize that they're being influenced by, because their favorite bands were influenced by them and their favorite bands were influenced by them. And I think that
100%.
That's a really funny thing to look at with like just the history of these different genres,
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, like I brought up the swancore thing earlier. It's a very popular genre right now, pioneered by bands that sound like Will Swan's music. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of that in very guitar-driven music, but I think one of the artists that kind of gets left out in a lot of that is Omar Rodriguez Lopez from At the Drive-In and the Mars Volta.
Oh, yeah.
And that for us, that's a really big influence, even in like stage performance and things like that. But I think you go into a lot of those artists nowadays that are actually out there. I mean, you got the Hail the Suns, Sergio from Idola, incredible, and you probably ask them, and they're probably absolutely influenced by artists like that. But you don't necessarily hear that from a lot of the guitar players and musicians nowadays, and it kind of it allows them to be sort of pigeonholed, and it becomes sort of an echo chamber. Mm-hmm. And you don't want that. You want experimentation, and part of that comes from understanding the roots and the music history and knowing where those things came from.
Well, and honestly, with like the pop punk thing, I think that pop punk kind of going away for like 5 years or something like that. Not fully going away, but, not nearly as big as it was, from like late 90s, even up until like the mid 2010s. And it feels like just going away for that amount of time, and kind of like the next generation who's been largely influenced by like a lot of hip hop and trap and stuff like that, but then also kind of grew up with that 2000s pop punk sound. And I feel like that's how you get to where we are now, is that it's the new generation taking the stuff from the last 10 years, but then also the stuff that they grew up with and putting them together.
It's a wonderful melting pot of music, and one of the things that kind of get into talking about this next artist I'm gonna pull up is when you look at some of these younger bands, you wonder how relatable not just your music is going to be to them as an artist, but how relatable their music is going to be to you. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be some sort of separation gap when it comes to time and influences and everything. But one of my favorite parts about this new younger crop of musicians, and I'll mention it a few times with a couple of these artists, is not only are they really talented at what they do and ambitious, they're really wise and smart and well-versed in music and bands that really pioneered a lot of these genres we have now. And I was having conversations with one of them the other day, and dude's like 16, 17 17 years old and is talking to me about like Hum and all these just old, incredible acts that their parents would listen to. And to have that still have influence, prominent influence in musicians nowadays can be pretty inspiring. And to see that influence show up in their music as well is also incredible and allows that relatability.
And with streaming, it's so much more accessible because you can just pull up a playlist that's like, you know, classic bands from whatever genre, and you can go back to and even discover some of the like cult classics have now a much larger than cult following, you know, years after the fact because of the internet and kind of getting like a second resurgence.
Yeah, gatekeeping really isn't a thing anymore. One of my favorite songs by LCD Sound System is Losing My Edge. Yeah, and it's about this scenario where James Murphy, the frontman of that project, was a DJ in New York City in the late 90s, early 2000s, and would have all these old can records and stuff like that, and stuff that people just could not find anywhere. And you would have to actually know people to go and find those records. And then all of a sudden, and I imagine it was in relation to the dawn of just the internet and accessibility, all these kids were showing up with all these same records and everything and didn't have to put in the legwork to find them. And it goes through him lamenting this whole scenario of they're better looking and have better ideas, but they're also they're really nice, you know. So it's this weird juxtaposition of feeling things pass you by. But I think, you know, the flip side of that is the accessibility. You know, you don't need to gatekeep anymore because everyone can find everything, and it's really just a matter of, hey, are you able to sift through the madness and find it for yourself?
Oh,
you know?
yeah, for sure. So what did you have up next? You kind of started to do a segue, and then we went off into another thing. But
well, I can actually re-segue into that because one of my favorite parts about this next band is their knowledge of music. One of their different creative avenues is TikTok. I don't know if they still do it, but they have a channel dedicated to just discovering random vinyl.
Oh, that's cool.
And going into a shop, getting like 4 or 5 different vinyl because they look cool, zero prior knowledge, bringing them home and listening to them. The band I'm talking about is Big Yellow. They're good friends of mine. I've really only known these cats for about a year and a half now. Like I said, there's this whole blossoming scene of musicians and creatives out of Georgia State University, Kennesaw, a lot of these metro Atlanta areas that sprouted up after the pandemic. And I think, you know, a lot of these people had a lot of time on their hands and were asking themselves, hey, you know, how can I actually create something? And you know, I'm sure a lot of them had stuff in the works beforehand, but the amount of time that it gave for people just to simmer on those ideas and create and figure out what they wanted to do, there was this immense explosion when people could have shows again.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And about a year and a half ago, there's this little underground arts district in Atlanta called Underground Atlanta. It's a real historical district. It used to be one of the main sites of debauchery in Atlanta over the years, in the clubs in the 80s and even in the Prohibition era. They would have tunnels down there that you could sneak into. Well, now it's, you know, a DIY space for bands to come in and play, and for the past 2 years, there was a line of 3 little art venues that were like art galleries that they converted into music venues. Okay. And these kids would just go out there and play shows multiple nights a week. So you could just walk down there and discover a new band, go see someone that you already know, find new art vendors. And it's, this growing area. I think they've been trying to put a lot of money into it. Sometimes that can be a good thing. Sometimes that can be a bad thing because, you'll turn one of those art venues, DIY spaces, into like a tapas bar, and then kids can't play there anymore. They can't cut their teeth, and then it gets more competitive.
Yeah, I get that for sure, too.
One of the best parts about this community right now is there's just opportunities to play music. There's opportunities for kids to go fail and cut their teeth and play to empty rooms, but they're not playing to empty rooms because these rooms are packed. And one of the reasons why is this band, Big Yellow, and they have done a lot to not just invest in their own community, but to make a mark for themselves. I mentioned it earlier, but Nico, one of the members of the band, was the director for our last 2 music videos,
okay.
Watch the Tale and Sunset in a Sense. And to see how ambitious and professional and cerebral that kid is really astounding, because I did not know what I was doing in a film aspect, in a music aspect at that age. And to see how smart they are, Nico, Alex, Musashi. Also shout out to Chucho, who was the cinematographer for both videos. Pretty sure that dude is 18 and just
That's crazy.
not just one of the best like videographers around here that I've seen at that age, but just a really kind dude, and I have a lot of love for all of those cats. So this next song is by Big Yellow. It's called "Theme from an Angry Phone Call." I'm actually in the music video along with John Mark Kendricks from Aces Over Kings, the Cascadent single. It's a great music video and is actually the reason that we brought them on to do ours. So this is "Theme for an Angry Phone Call" by Big Yellow.